Hey guys, Speculative Sandbox now has a shop. Treat yourself with graphic tees, tanks, stickers, and notebooks. Check out the podcast notes for a link, and don't forget to use the promo code Sandbox to get 20% off.
Sleeping Beauty is a huge one. I mean, this girl is literally going to lie in this bed in a tower until she turns to dust, until the prince gets it together and comes to kiss her because she's so gorgeous, right?
Yeah.
So
Thank
if
goodness
Sleeping
for beauty. Could you imagine if you didn't have that? What kind of damsel you'd be?
Right. So if she was sleeping not Beauty, I mean, like, would anybody show up for her? I don't know.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one. The damsel in distress is a classic trope that typically places a female character in danger so that the hero can save the day. Picture Lois Lane trapped in the helicopter hanging off the edge of the Daily Planet building, or Mary Jane Watson frequently used as bait because the villain always knew Spider-Man would come and save her. While these are all fictional stories, stories tend to reflect or influence the real world around us. Author Bibiana Krall returns to the podcast to discuss this trope, how it impacts everyone, and the ways we can de-stress the damsel role. So you were telling me you were meeting with your film director? What was that about?
Yeah, well, we meet every week. We're co-writing a novel together, and it's being developed into a feature film. So it's really interesting. I've co-written before, but I've never co-written this way, where literally the first draft isn't even fully drafted, and we're doing, paragraph or scene edits and that kind of stuff together over the phone, and we're using Google Docs so we can do it in real time together.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really different. It's really interesting. At first, it was really hard for me because I'm used to being by myself, working alone, and then when everything's at least doesn't make me sick to my stomach, then I share it with someone who to look at it,
Yeah.
So sometimes when I'm really not super thrilled about, what I wrote last week or whatever, I always kind of feel like that little kid with like the hair sticking up getting school pictures.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
You're forced to share an incomplete project with someone else because
right.
hopefully will help make it better together.
Right. And it's painful. I mean, it really feels like somebody's got your hand like in the drawer and they're like squeezing it closed sometimes because you're like, God, this feels so uncomfortable.
Is it
But
faster to have two heads?
no, actually, it's longer.
Okay.
So I'm thinking that in the future, as we're actually looking at doing projects until basically I have my Viking funeral. So this is we're probably going to do a novel a year, and we've got a film to follow it. So I mean, like, for the rest of my life.
Wow. Nice.
Yeah, there are 82 projects to be developed. So I'm not going to live that long. I hope to God I don't live that long. But anyway, what I'm going to suggest in the next one is that we do a whole chapter and make sure everybody's sort of on bar with the chapter. I do a chapter, they do a chapter, and back and forth, and we have an agreed upon, format of how we're going to reach the arc and make the conclusion and all that kind of stuff. So we have it broken down a little bit before we start, and then spend a month, like 50 pages at a time or whatever, doing hardcore, and then somebody gets to edit and somebody gets the line edit, and then the editor gets it.
Wow. Now, when you are in the initial drafting stages, is that when you try to catch the stylistic differences between both of you so that they kind of read as one similar voice, or do you catch that in later drafts?
Um, well, this is the first time I've ever done anything quite like this, but what I've realized is that the story itself, as the characters sort of really started developing, I would say in chapter two, it started kind of creating its own style. So it's really weird. It's a hybrid between the two of us, and it it sort of activated on its own.
That's cool. That's awesome. So I'm glad that you were able to take some time away from your very busy schedule to join me again on Speculative Sandbox. We have some regular listeners who probably already remember you from our Ghost Stories episode. But for those that are just tuning in, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Bibiana Krall. I'm a novelist, a short story writer, and a poet. And I am working on my 28th title, which is coming out September 5th. So I'm pretty excited.
That's exciting. We are talking about damsels in distress. Specifically, I'm calling it de-stressing the damsel. At what point in your life, both of us being women and kind of being influenced by pop culture growing up, at what point did you realize that damsel in distress was a thing?
Um, like a thing, I think for me, it was probably when I was about 10 or 11 years old, and um, I had sort of a feeling in my mind that if I was going to live life on my own terms, I was going to have to learn to save myself, learn
Hmm.
to take care of myself, and to rely on myself first. And so as I was reading, sort of the MG and YA didn't really exist in the form it does now when I was, 12, 13, 14 years old, but there were stories that kind of matched that tempo, and a lot of them had, the damsel in distress or somebody's going to save me kind of themes in them, because at least girls my age back then read things that were more romantically inclined, I think. Um, but that's about when I think I was pretty young, 10 or 11 years old.
Yeah, I would say Disney is probably my first exposure to damsel in distress tropes because you have Sleeping Beauty and Snow
Right.
White and with Cinderella. Yeah, the prince had to come and kind of help her out in the originals when she
Mm-hmm.
was locked up. I was very fortunate to have some very strong characters offset that in my youth. Xena Warrior Princess was a huge influence on me. My own mother was a huge influence because she had, left Vietnam on her not technically on her own. She had to use the systems to work for her so that she could escape, and then embarked on her own essentially. And she's always had a fiercely independent spirit. So I'm fortunate to have had that exposure because I kept finding the damsel in distress or the did in so many places. And at the same time, I was also exposed to the expectation that my father has to be the one to solve the problems or sit back and let the guys figure it out, and very subtle nuances of life. And I realized how much fiction and reality kind of overlap. How would you define the damsel in distress trope? What are some classic examples?
Well, I looked some things up to sort of see if the general Googleati, felt the same way as I did, and they kind of do. I mean, for me, certainly, Sleeping Beauty is a huge one. I mean, this girl is literally going to lie in this bed in a tower until she turns to dust, until the prince gets it together and comes to kiss her because she's so gorgeous, right?
Yeah.
So, so
Thank
if
goodness
Sleeping
for beauty. Could
Beauty,
you imagine if you didn't have that? What kind of damsel you'd be?
right, right. So if she was sleeping not Beauty, I mean, like, would anybody show up for her? I don't know.
We won't tell that story.
Maybe, maybe we should. Maybe that would actually be a way to start sort of pulling this apart. Even though, I loved the fairy tales as a girl of, the beautiful girl like Rapunzel, she gets thrown up in a tower because she's like so gorgeous and has this fantastic hair.
Hmm.
And then some weirdo dude shows up and wants to climb her braid. Like, what's that? Yeah.
I was always like, why couldn't she just climb down her own hair? And she probably
Or
could have.
right, or cut her hair off, tied it to the leg of a chair, and climbed down and said, "Bye, Dad. Bye, everybody. I'm out of here." I mean,
Hmm. I went jump back into history a little bit because I wanted to see where were some other classic examples besides the fairy tales that I loved to read growing up. Some of them I saw on TV and cartoons, the woman tied to the train tracks, the classic, damsel. And then even in Greek mythology, I found Perseus slays a beast to get to Andromeda, who is chained naked to a rock. A lot of women in very vulnerable situations in Greek mythology. And then
mm-hmm.
propaganda, Allied propaganda during World War I portrayed German-occupied Belgium as a damsel in distress, transforming Allied soldiers into knights bent on saving their victim, which was the city. So a lot of portrayals. How do you feel about this trope? Like, what would you find to be like the most problematic?
Well, for me, what the real problem is, I mean, if you really, really boil it down, at least from my philosophy, the way I live my life, is that there's a long-standing myth that is completely off chart, off base, that women are weak, that women need to be saved. They don't. And uh, a strong woman, a woman who knows what she wants, a woman who has enough wisdom to realize also what she needs, chooses their partner, chooses which way they go down a path. They don't just lay down on train tracks and wait for some cowboy to ride maybe randomly through this valley to come pull her off the train tracks.
Hmm.
So, you know, my real problem is that it goes hand in hand with women as trophies, women as objects, women as something to be won or something to sort of keep in the vault, so to speak. I mean, it's really problematic because it really feeds into a very old-fashioned idea that women are not in the same league mentally, physically, spiritually, whatever, as men. And I have a real problem with it.
Yeah, I agree. I felt that impact a lot on my own capabilities growing up.
Right.
The feeling and expectation that that's how women are naturally portrayed. Therefore, that must be
Mm-hmm.
all that's an accurate representation of you. All the men in the movies represent what men want to be and how they see themselves. So, therefore, by proxy, I assume that the female characters are the same. Girlfriend roles that are constantly needing to be saved. Oh, the concept of fridging the girlfriend, which I believe originated in a Nightwing comic where he comes home and he finds the girlfriend in the fridge. She was died, or in the freezer or some whatever. She was
Oh,
died, cut up and
yeah.
placed in there. And that was supposed to be the motives for him moving forward. And so we have so many examples of fridging the girlfriend. I commonly see them and I'm like, no, we fridged another one. I
Right.
What I realized was as I started seeing more proactive women, I remember thinking, oh, you could actually do that. And I think that helped empower me in my own life to kind of step forward and go, no, these are my feelings and my thoughts, and they just have as much of an equal ground as the men around me.
Absolutely.
Do you think we've done a good job moving away from the damsel in distress trope today?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't. No, I don't. Well, here's the thing is that I'm not going to say how someone else feels is wrong. I'm not I try not to judge on people however they want to view things as long as it's not infringing on my, personal space or whatever that's cool. But on the other hand, I guess the real problem is for me the idea that if any of us are sitting around waiting to be saved by someone else, what we're really doing is shelving our own power and giving it to someone else, some random person, some random stranger. And what that does is it, in fact, really cripples us in the moment and keeps us from moving forward into whatever it is that we most desire, maybe we should be doing in the first place. So we're waiting around for some phantom that may or may not ever show up. And that bothers me.
I also think about the weight that places on the male role, where
Sure.
guys are having to be responsible for their roles, and if there's a constant expectation to carry the weight of, let's say, the entire family, or someone other than himself, that's a lot to carry. And I feel like over time that naturally there's going to be resentments that come
Sure.
out of that. And so uh, at the same time, being able to break through the gender roles, where being like, what maybe it's a undue, trying to think, undue pressure on men to carry excess responsibility, but it's become so normalized that to them it might be strange to offset some of that responsibility, and they might see it as a failure of their own role, when really it's just a very difficult system for many people to exist under. And the point of it is, how can someone have their own autonomy in their own life? And
Yeah,
what's
I think there is oh, sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
Um I think there's a lot of pressure on both sides. I think there's pressure from, well, if we go away from gender, we'll just say the passive role versus the dominant role, regardless of, how whatever else is going on in your life, personal wise. There's in relationships, there's give and take, and you have somebody who maybe is more passive day to day and then will stand up for something that's really important to them, and then you have someone who's kind of dominates the daily choices or whatever, and then gives up on the weekends and says, "You make those decisions." But I think it's the real issue with these tropes that basically are very ingrained in, these passive sort of, you figure it out, you take care of it, whatever. It does, as you said, it puts an extraordinary amount of pressure on whoever that dominant decision making, person is. And if they choose wrong, what happens? Are they absolutely crushed because they didn't make the right decision? But the other person was just like, oh, you figure it out. Oh, you do it. You're this, you're that. And so I think both sides, and I can't speak for everyone, but I'm looking at it that way. I would imagine that both sides of this coin are tired of this trope for totally different reasons.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, I do appreciate, at least in the most basic kind of sense, the romanticism of that sort of like swooping in magic, that someone can somehow have ESP and know you're on the train tracks, and they ride a million miles to come save you. I mean, that stuff's really cool. But boiling it all down, though, it feels troublesome from an expectation standpoint.
Mhm. And it's scary too. I mean, we have these stories that we have developed a mythology of, you'll
Uh-huh.
be okay, someone will come in and save you, putting complete and utter trust in whatever that authority figure, is, dominant
Right.
figure is. But then you enter the real world and there's so many flaws in the system. And we can even think about, like, your own safety, walking home, like, being taking the bus, public transport. Um, it's really important as a woman to be proactive in your own safety as well, because maybe even the things that you rely on for safety might fail you. And
Mhm.
I always just think, I don't really know where I'm going with that.
I agree with you, though. I agree with you. For instance, like, next week I'm going to the mountains, and I'm going to be in a wilderness area, like really wild, like bears, panthers, who knows? And uh, am I relying on my husband, or am I relying on the local people to tell me what I might encounter, or to tell me to be smart enough to bring, something warm to wear, maybe some extra strength pain medicine in case I sprain my ankle or whatever. I do all of that on my own. And the reason I do all of that on my own is I have learned in my life that if I can depend on myself, I can't control anything else or any situation. But what I can do is at least be in the knowledge that I have done my best to be prepared, which also makes me feel more ready for that next level of preparedness, which includes, villains, extraterrestrials landing, whatever other problem happens in 2022. I'm running out of ideas of what else could happen, but you know what I'm saying? Like
Hmm.
sort of feeling prepared, even if you're not totally 100% prepared, makes you feel more actively engaged with um, your strength when you need it.
Yeah, I agree. I might get hate for this, but there's a contemporary fantasy romance series by Sarah J. Maas, I believe is her name, called A Court of Thorns and Roses. It is
Uh-huh.
a Beauty and the Beast retelling. So you've got Stockholm Syndrome and everything. It's your classic, yeah, damsel in distress situation where she's locked up by this beast. In this case, it's a girl, a woman that is held captive by this fairy prince. And I read a couple of books. I mean, I found it. I mean, it's got erotica, and of course, that's going to be great too. There's moments and times for that, and I enjoyed the books for those fantasy elements. But one thing that I really had a hard time with was the passive female role for a majority of the books when she is uh controlled by these male characters, and the only way she was able to escape the first what ended up becoming an abusive boyfriend was when another future boyfriend saved her, whisked her off, and then she falls in love with him in a different place. You're slapping your head.
I am. I know. I'm gobsmacking myself. Oh my goodness. Well, I can't speak to the series because I haven't read it. I have heard about it though. I have heard about it that was terrific, and and it rang a lot of bells and all of that. But oh my God, you know, all I can say is that if that's what you like, that's totally cool. But from my perspective as a woman, as a writer, as someone who has been living life on their own terms for a really long time, what I would say is how, as a woman writer, can my stories serve the generation that will hopefully be reading my books, after my Viking funeral? And is that what I want to leave for them from this perspective? No. And if it's what you want to do, that's also cool. But I really feel like we have this opportunity to talk to people that we will never meet. And do I want to tell them that an ex-boyfriend from the future is who they have to wait for? Oh dear God, no.
Hmm. Yeah, I think in real life, it's one of those things where you aren't if you're constantly relying on someone else to save you, you aren't forming your own identity. And
Right.
you think about a lot of situations where people actually take advantage of people who are in bad situations, and there's grooming and conditioning involved. And obviously these books are written to be light and fun and entertainment, and like you said, there are people like enjoy your kinks, absolutely. But
Right. Like whatever you're into.
right, exactly. I think another example where when I was trying to think, have we done a good job moving away from the damsel in distress trope? Black Widow in Marvel Cinematic Universe, she's so like clearly filmed from a sexualized perspective, even though she's supposed to be an empowering character. You've got butt shots after butt shots. She's got this gorgeous figure, and most of the time they're body doubles. And I'm not saying she's gorgeous, of course, but you have dewy-eyed fantasy type lines and facial expressions. There's nothing, she's not a problem to anybody. She's perfectly, along for the ride. And then when the Black Widow movie came out, or actually I wouldn't say Endgame, you started to see more complexities in human. You didn't see this dewy-eyed character all the time. And I really, and that's when I started going, yes, sisters, we're here together. And I think that's good. But from the start, even though it was like she was disguised as a strong character, but I just remember thinking she's impossible to exist.
I'm not sure if I would say that she's impossible to exist per se. I mean, I actually have met that combination. where you get
Really?
like the beauty, the bombshell beauty, and then you get the sort of like, a little bit of grit underneath that dewy, gorgeous skin. It's a rare combination, but it's a lethal one because nobody knows what to do with that person, right? But um, you know, I think I think we all have a long way to go in the portrayal of the strong character. And then there's the overcompensating aspects where you have like, Wonder Woman who could just ping metal until the end of time with her bracelets, and she can get all the truth out of you with her invisible rope. And like, so that's almost the other extreme,
Mm-hmm.
where they're loyal and they're gorgeous and they know things, and they can do martial arts and fly invisible airplanes. And I mean, I think that's wonderful, and that also is to me a fantasy. But what I'd like to really see is um a damsel who is not in distress, but a damsel who actually is strong enough to show that she needs things and that she has this human factor to her. But in the face of adversity or in the face of making choices, she's not deferring to other people, she's making her own. And that's the character that I want to see more of, that I think would scare a lot of people. But I think that character is the character that needs to come forth.
I haven't seen it yet, but there's a movie called Prey, I believe, that just came out. It's like an
Yeah.
origin story for Predator, and it has a female character that I think is in a circumstance and she's able to protect herself or fight off the monster. This is me just going off of quick summaries, but I know that it's been an interesting discussion online about her as far as how people perceive her. And it does seem like um there's a pit, like a lot of people are undermining this character's capabilities, comparing her to like if a bunch of men came in with their guns blazing, how is it that she was able to take on the monster? And so like there's all this doubt that people are trying to like attack her by, but I feel like it's just interesting how that kind of character can be perceived so threatening when it's, I don't know, it's a good example of strength to be able to overcome these things and take on, like I guess she was a bow and arrows and like classic kind of materials, no guns. Anyway,
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think it's really interesting that people would attack a character like that, but then if you flipped it and made that a male character, like you watch, we'll say a James Bond. And I love James Bond. I just love him because he's just exactly who he is. You know what you're gonna get, and he always has at least, two chicks before he starts blowing things up. I just love James Bond because he's fun.
Mhm.
But I don't take it too seriously. I don't say, oh, so I don't look at him in a political sense or a feministic sense. I'm just like, to me, that's pure entertainment. But when you start picking apart, though, we'll say an adventure story or a thriller, and the super brain, super capable person that's a spy or whatever that can take down a whole, corrupt country or group of people or whatever. When it's a woman, the woman has to be like from, graduated from MIT and have a PhD in like, weaponry or whatever. Whereas if it's a guy, it could just be a really good looking guy who grew up on an English estate or whatever, and he happens to have a couple $1 million, and
Mm.
so he's automatic. So it feels like even in these imaginary like roles, if it's a female and they are doing exactly the same thing, we're just changing it male to female, the female has to be 300 times more gifted, more educated, more everything. And that feels to me also like it's perpetuating some of these issues, because if we feel like it's the same monster, but you need to be 300 times stronger to tackle that monster if you're a female, like what is that really saying about
Mhm.
the people writing it, the people consuming it? Like, we are literally drinking the Kool-Aid.
What did you, speaking of James Bond, what do you think of Bond girls and how they're portrayed over the years?
Well, Bond girls, in my opinion, they could be seen two different ways. Bond girls, obviously they're objectified. I mean, we got a lot of skin. We always have them ending up in bed somewhere with James, right?
Hmm.
We got him coming out of the water. We've got him showing up in casinos and, all of that. And to me, that's the fantasy aspect of, sort of the Ian Fleming era when we had men who were men and men who were going to be sure that the war ended and the Nazis were gone. And so I that whole sort of really strong masculinity thing, it kind of makes me laugh because in real life, I mean, seriously, how many people have you met that look like a Bond girl? And so to me, that's like hardcore male fantasy, and it always kind of makes me giggle. Um, but on the other hand, often if you go a little deeper, which they never do actually in the film, at least they tend not to, um, the woman has all of these skills. She's a negotiator, or she works for some crime syndicate, and she's like a mastermind, and or she's survived all of these traumas in her life, and now she's ensnaring James. So I love the fact that none of these females who look absolutely just ravishing and amazing, that all of these women are just, they're sirens. They're like super smart, super dangerous, super everything. So, of course, James would be attracted to them. Who wouldn't be? They're like, shiny diamonds, just like laying right in front of like, wow. But I do feel like it does objectify women. But for some reason in James Bond, I always forgive it. I can't even really explain that myself. So I don't know. What do you feel about the Bond girls?
I haven't watched the most, well, I did actually. I did. I watched a little bit of the most recent one with Ana de Armas. I hope I'm saying it right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think I saw the first half of the movie and she seemed very empowered. Like she was showing up to things and fighting people and everything. And I was like, that's pretty great. I think it's when, I think just the lore of James Bond, that what makes him such a stud, aside from being able to take on the enemy and a lot of their henchmen, is that he's a ladies' man and he's able to be with gorgeous women, and that is such a fantasy. But I guess when the women end up dying horrible deaths as while they are helping him, I think a good example of this is it's the one with when he goes on an island with her, and it was the guy from No Country for Old Men, right?
Oh yeah, it was the one before this one.
Was it the
It was, or no, actually it was this
few
one with
before?
Anna de Armas. It is the one with the island that blows up.
No, it's the one where they go. I think they go to the island where this supervillain lives. It's the I should probably just look it up. That's the beauty of podcasts. You can just edit James Bond movies. Let's see. Javier
Well,
Bardem. It is Skyfall. So
oh, Skyfall, yeah.
they go to Javier Bardem's lair, which I thought was on an island, and she ends up being working for them too, or something like that. And they
Mhm.
chain her up to a rock and shoot her, and she's just hanging dead in the background. And I was like,
Yeah,
oh my god. Like, I think she even helped James and just became, all right, well, we're done with her, moving on. I think when characters are
yeah.
treated like that and it's based solely on like their gender roles and what they mean to James as an object to literally use, that's a bit hard to swallow, I guess. Now I'm
Yeah, you're
curious.
right. That was upsetting. I'm thinking about it now, and I remember that particular scene, and I was like, yeah, it is upsetting because these fights, or these battles that James has with these bad guys. You're right. The woman just becomes basically a unwanted piece of furniture at that point, and it is upsetting. You're right.
Yeah. So I guess it's still a gray area. But there have been some great examples where they've inverted the trope into something more empowering. I've seen a lot more women superheroes, especially taking center stage in the MCU right now. Women saving themselves. Most recently, Layla in Moon Knight. I really liked that because at one point she's on a ledge in a cave, and the main character, the Moon Knight character, is off somewhere else dealing with his own demons. And I almost thought this was one of those scenes where she's in trouble and he's going to swoop in and save her. And nope, she ends up saving herself, and it's foreshadowing for later when she becomes a superhero herself. I really liked that. And then you have women-centric stories like Pixar's Turning Red, which examines the coming of age story of a girl, and we learn about hormonal changes, periods, body odor, confusing sexual attractions. That's one of the things I find. I was so relieved to see that because we are surrounded by female sexualization everywhere, but I was raised where, and of course Turning Red has an Asian American angle to it, and I am Asian American, to be ashamed of sex and any sex acts. It was something that my mom was like so conservative about. And it's weird for me growing up to see women hypersexualized and then told, do not do that. You are a slut, if you do that. So being able to
Right.
have them actually address that, where the main character in Turning Red feels shame for having a crush on the boy at the corner store. I thought that was really important to examine.
Like looking at more recent things. Actually, last night I didn't realize that Lock and Key was back on Netflix, and I started watching it, and the mom, I can't think of her name, but the mom actually took on two demons, didn't shed a tear, and thought on her feet, and was just, I mean, she was really, really rocking it, and dispatched them and didn't even break a sweat, which is probably not super realistic, obviously. But on the other hand, she started, the mom, in my opinion, in the first season as kind of this weak, sort of mousy person who was lost and didn't know where she was, and she was always kind of uncomfortable with herself as a woman who maybe wanted to have some romantic interest, and all this other stuff. So she kind of started in season one as sort of this gentle, weepy kind of person. And last night, I mean, in the second show, she was kicking demons' ass by herself and not waiting for anybody to come help her. So I appreciate growth like that, but I also appreciate the fact that you can take a character like that who's really kind of demure and a little bit wishy-washy, other than like the gentle, like the whole mild-mannered female kind of drives me nuts a little bit too. I mean, like any female I know is not always mild-mannered, like hello
Mhm.
life. So it's nice to see characters that get mad sometimes, and or that are, happy and accept themselves the way they are. As you were saying about the new Pixar show, where whatever it is that goes on with yourself as you're growing up with your own body is part of your experience, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's you as a human being embracing your humanity. So, but I was just really, really happy to see that, because the only character that I really connected with the first two seasons was the evil villain, Dodge, because I was like, I get what this chick is doing. She's got her mission, she's got her moment, and she's gonna do whatever it takes to get there, and that's okay if you're a villain, right?
That's true, where sometimes the villainous role is the one where it feels like it's acceptable to have those wants and needs. What do you think of criticisms towards strong female characters where they claim it's pandering? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, who are they pandering to? I guess is my first question.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think a really good example of where I think people were so split on it was in Endgame, where all the females were together and carrying the what is it, the gauntlet or something, and it just seemed like a pandering shot, and people really got stuck on it a little bit, claiming what is and what is real representation.
Well, what I'm going to say is this is that for thousands of years, storytelling has been pandering to Ben. So if we're going to pander, how about we send a little love towards my section?
Nicely said. Okay. Let's see. What advice do you have for writers who want to be more thoughtful or turn the damsel in distress trope on its head?
I think the best way to turn the trope on its head is to think in your mind who are the strongest, women that you know. And when you take the strongest one that you know, write down what it is that makes them strong in your mind. Like, what is it that makes them strong? Can they lift 300 pounds? Um, are they, do they always have a witty comeback when somebody says something cruel? Like, write all those things down and put those in the blender and really think about them and be mindful when you're empowering your characters, your fictional characters, be mindful that you're not actually saying, oh, well, they're not strong enough, so I'm going to give them a sword. Oh, they're not strong enough, so I'm going to give them a PhD. Oh my gosh. To me, that would be pandering because what you're not doing is you're not developing them in a way that they would be realistic to the people who need to hear from them. So, and of course you can have a sword and a PhD. I mean, why not?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just saying that if you use strong characteristics of a human being and you put them in the crayon box and pretend like it's like a silk scarf or a belt, I call BS on that.
My next question might be a little interesting. When is a damsel in distress character appropriate to the story?
Well, it's funny that you say that because I just finished writing a story a couple of months ago, actually, a short story where there is a, I would say, kind of oblivious person thinking they're doing whatever, and then you have aggressor. Well, all of these players are female, and so you have the devious female, you have the female with something to gain, and then you have the female who's not listening to her gut, who's not listening to her intuition. And guess what happens?
Mm.
So the damsel in distress in this particular story is being used as a mirror or a reflection of the really what I would consider the over dramatized villain. And it's kind of fun because it feels like you're sort of doing shots of tequila, you're like, which one, which your head swiveling. And I did it on purpose. I did it for a reason. But sometimes the damsel in distress, if they're offset with a villain who's of the same sex, who potentially could even have the same sort of, I will say, virtues or non-virtues, what you get is a really beautiful reflection, perhaps, of society, the things that need to go, um, society, the things that could perhaps improve it if you took A, B, C. So, and you don't want to not entertain people in a story, so you don't want to make it glaringly obvious. You don't want to, just drown them with all of that kind of stuff. But if you can put some of those little glints of detail in those scenes between those two, I think what happens in your subconscious is your brain starts really separating, the noodles from the vegetables. We'll just
Mm.
put it that way.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this discussion. It was very enlightening. Do you have any last remarks or promotions?
Well, it's thank you for having me again. It was so terrific. I mean, we went from ghost to damsels in distress. So thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I guess, if anybody's in the mood for Halloween stories, My anthology with Veronica Coyne-Barton, Wicked Mist, is coming out September 5th, and it's our third year, and we are potentially pitching it as a streaming series in a couple of months. I'm knocking on wood, and we'll see what happens.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.